So I walked out into our garage, and I flipped the light switch on, and all of a sudden this blue arc went across the garage. It crackled and popped and boomed. It was about this big around, and it was absolutely stunning. And I looked at that and I thought, I'm not an electrician, but I think that's bad. So I turned the light off and I'm like, can't fix this with duct tape. I probably better call somebody. So I went and I Googled electricians, and I did this really scientific process of elimination. I basically looked for who had the most sincere sounding name and called them. And I mean, how else do you pick somebody, right? Because the only people who write reviews are not happy. So I picked the sincere sounding person, and I called and got their receptionist, and I said, hi, I have an electrical problem. And I explained what it was to her, and she said, sir, you do not have an electrical problem. You have an electrical emergency. I'm like, well, I'm glad I called. And she said, I'm going to send a repair person over immediately. And I thought, note to self. Next time somebody says, oh, it'll take us 3 weeks to get somebody out there, I'm going to go, there was this blue arc. Is that bad? Okay, I would never do that. Okay, I would totally do that. So they send the service person out, and the service person comes and looks at it, and he looks at me and he goes, sir, you are so lucky that your house didn't burn down. We ended up having to rewire a portion of the house, and it was pretty scary. I was so struck with how close we came to something disastrous happening. And at that point, even though it was a lot of money, I was glad that we had the chance to rewire the house so that we could actually live in it. And that's what I thought about this week when I was thinking about Easter. And it sounds a little bit weird, but let me tell you why. Because on that first Easter week, we came so close to something disastrous happening. And we still come close to something disastrous happening. And we might actually need some rewiring to fully understand it. So I want you to listen to the scripture this morning, which is out of Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. It's not a typical Easter Sunday passage, but you'll get it. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So let me explain this a little bit, and I want to start with the context because context is always king. The most interesting part of this passage happens right before this passage. So they are up in the north of Israel, a place called Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus pulls his disciples together, and he says to them, there's a whole lot of buzz about me out there. What are people saying? And his disciples are like, well, some people think you're Elijah. Some people think you're this person or that person. You know, that's what the talk is on the street. And so Jesus goes, yeah, but who do you say I am? And Peter has this moment of clarity, and Peter says, you're the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. And Jesus looks at him and says, yeah, but don't tell anybody, which I've always thought was rather weird. But I want you to hang on to that for just a second. Because then we get to this passage where Jesus explains to his disciples how this whole Messiah thing is going to work. Jesus says, first, I have to go to Jerusalem. So they're way up in the north of the country. Jerusalem's in the middle. Got to go down to Jerusalem. Once we get there, I have to suffer at the hands of the authorities. And then I have to be killed. But On the third day, I will be raised from the dead. Now, this is so important that Jesus says this 3 times. Not in a row, but 3 times throughout the gospel. He says the very same thing. This is the way it's going to happen. Got to go to Jerusalem, going to suffer and die, but on the third day, I will be raised again. So this is pretty important. And then I love what happens. Jesus lays all this out, and Peter's response, Peter who just had this moment of tremendous clarity, Peter's response is, oh, no. And then I love, this is what I picture happening. I picture Peter walking over to Jesus, putting his arm around Jesus' shoulder and say, let's go for a walk, Jesus. And I think Peter walks Jesus around a little bit, and Peter says, third day resurrection, great, 100%. Suffering and dying, not so much. And why does he do that? Partly it's because this is not at all what Peter signed up for. Secondly, this is not how Peter thinks this thing should happen. Peter has another idea. And in fact, Peter thinks his idea is better than Jesus. And be careful before you judge Peter. So Peter shares that, what his plan is, and there's this telling comment that Jesus says. Jesus looks at Peter and he says, you're concerned about human stuff, but I'm concerned about God's stuff. And that's something I think we should note. That thing we're upset about, the bee in our bonnet, the burr under our saddle, the thing that's irritating us, the thing that has our focus, is that a God thing or is that an us thing? Because we have a tendency to focus on the tree, particularly our tree. And Jesus is kind of looking at the forest. Jesus has this plan that can be costly, and mostly we just want to remain comfortable. I'm absolutely convinced that the overall desire of the middle class is just to be left alone. But God wants to change the world. And so that leads to 2 different goals, a temporary goal versus an eternal goal. And that leads to different metrics, and that leads to different wins. And that gives us something to think about. Because when Peter is only thinking about how this thing is going to affect him and what he wants, that's when he gets into trouble. And this is how we almost have a disaster on our hands that very first Easter. Because Peter doesn't fully comprehend what God is up to. He can only see his part in it. And it's going to take some rewiring of Peter. It's going to take some new ways of thinking. It's going to take some new understanding for Peter to get it. And then Jesus makes it worse. Because Jesus starts to talk about denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and following him. Why in the world would you do that when basically you just want to be left alone? But then Jesus explains the rationale. If you lose your life for me, that's when you'll find it. And I think all the disciples are going, what's with all this losing stuff? That's not what we signed up for. And then Jesus answers the question, what good will it be to gain the whole world if you lose your soul? And then he says what's most important. Jesus says, I want to let you in on how this thing ends. We're not up in the air here. And the fact that there is so much fear among the followers of Jesus leads me to believe that we still don't get this. Keep the end in mind. We win. Jesus says, I'll be raised from the third day, and eventually I'm going to come back in the Father's glory with all of his angels. We win. We know how it ends. But his disciples are muttering, yeah, but the way you're going about it sure sounds like losing to us. And losing is hard because we like to win. We don't like to lose. But what does it mean to win? How do you know if you won? Okay, if you're playing basketball or baseball, yeah, it's really easy to tell whether you won or not. You get more points, more runs than the other team does. But in an argument with a spouse or a friend, it's a little trickier to figure out who won. In a war, is there a winner? If you get divorced, please tell me who the winner was there. How do you tell if you've won in life? We generally define our wins in relationship to other people. And in order for some of us to win, it means somebody else has to lose. It's a zero-sum game. In order for us to win, somebody else has to lose. If somebody else is winning, we're probably losing. What if that could be changed? What if everyone won and it didn't cost you anything for somebody else to win too? And I'm not talking about participation trophies so nobody cries on the way home. I'm talking about, what if there were no more war? What if there was no more divorce? What if there was no more pain? What if there was no more needing to compare ourselves to other people so we can win? And what if there was no more evil that caused all of that in the first place? Because that's what God's grace looks like. And that's the glory of Easter. In Jesus, we can all win. Because in the previous situation, pre-Easter, no matter what your advantages were, everyone ultimately lost. So Easter is a win. But it's about winning in a particular sort of way. I mean, the win of Easter is that evil is overcome. So death is defeated, and God is reestablishing his kingdom. And that's important to remember. We're going back to where we started from. God had a kingdom that was set up where everything was the way that it was supposed to be. God wants it to be like that again. And so God is renewing everything, so we go back to the future. And because of that, change is possible. Things do not have to remain the same. Injustice, hatred, hopelessness, you name the pain, it can be changed. Things will get better. And so we can have hope. We can have deep, abiding peace, no matter what you're going through in your life at this point. No matter how dark the valley is that you are walking through, hope can still happen. Peace can happen. And how does that come to be? Jesus going to the cross. Because I hate to be a stickler about this, but here's just a little technical point. There has to be a death before there can be a resurrection. And here's the scary thing. Like I said at the beginning, we almost missed it. We almost missed it. So how do we almost miss Easter? Well, we look at Easter through a particular lens after 2,000 years of Easters. But if you were around for the events of that very first Holy Week, you would feel very differently. Because no matter how you measure it, it looked like a failure. There is no way that it looks like a big win. Remember, even on Easter Sunday, his disciples still didn't believe. At the very best, they were confused. And all of Jesus' disciples had deserted him, because this is not what they signed up for. This is not what they hoped for. This is not what they believed that God wanted. Take, for example, Judas Iscariot. Now, Judas is the disciple that betrays Jesus. Iscariot is not Judas's last name. Iscariot is Judas's political party. So when you hear Judas Iscariot, it is really Judas the Sicarii. Sicarii are assassins. They belong to the political party that basically says, we're going to take out anybody who stands in the way of the reestablishment of the Jewish kingdom. And so when Judas sees Jesus, Judas is like, here's a man after my own heart, because he wants to overthrow the government too. And that's probably why Judas jumps on the Jesus bandwagon. And so you have the events of Maundy Thursday, where Jesus says the person who is dipping, in the same bowl as me is the one who's going to betray me. And Judas goes, you don't mean me, Lord. And Jesus is like, yeah, you. And I think what really goes on, Judas leaves at that point. Jesus and his disciples go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he wrestles with this thing. Judas comes back with the temple guard. And I think that Judas doesn't do it so much to betray Jesus as he does to force Jesus' hand. He's like, okay, I know that he wants to take over the government. I know that he wants to throw off the Roman oppressors. And if I force the issue, if I bring the army there, then Jesus is going to have to obliterate them. He's going to have to kick the Romans out. We're going to take over the government, and it will be glorious. I think that's what Judas thought would happen. He would force the hand of Jesus. Instead, Jesus surrenders to the empire. Jesus is unjustly put to death, just like he said. And it's interesting that it happened just like he said, but they forgot the next part that he had said. But I get that, because at one point, death seemed pretty final. But any way that his disciples want to measure it, sitting there early on the first Easter Sunday, Jesus lost. And that's why they mock him when he's on the cross. That's why people are like, yeah, there's the king of the Jews. He saved other people, but he can't save himself. Everybody thinks Jesus lost. And thank God for it. Because what looked like the biggest loss actually turns into the biggest win. But what if Jesus had taken the bait? I mean, we know that he wasn't thrilled by the prospects of being executed. I mean, he's not psychotic. The whole prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane is, God, do we really have to do this? Isn't there another way to do it? We know he's not thrilled. What if he'd taken the bait? Because the other thing that happens here is the temptations of Jesus have circled back again. And we are ending where we began. When Jesus says, what does it gain you if you get the whole world but lose your soul? He's referring back to his temptation in the desert, where Satan comes to him and shows him all of the kingdoms of the world and all of their splendor. And Satan says, if I give this, I will give all of this to you with one catch. If you bow down and worship me. If you'll abandon God and worship me, you can have all of this. And Jesus sees it for what it is. And he says, get behind me, Satan. And the temptation comes back around when Peter says, you don't need to do this. You can be king. And Jesus is like, what would it benefit me? See, Jesus is talking about us there when he says, what does it benefit a person if they gain the whole world but lose his soul? But he's also talking about himself, because it's his temptation that's come back around again. You can still have the whole world, and you don't have to do this. But Jesus sees it for what it was. What if Jesus had taken the bait? This is stunning to me. What if Jesus had listened to his closest friend? What would have happened? Remember, I said to hold on to how this whole passage starts with Jesus telling Peter, yeah, don't tell anyone that I'm the Messiah. And now this is why. Because Peter's going to get it wrong. He's going to tell people the wrong things about Jesus. I mean, we already know that what the disciples have their sights set on is just political power. They just want to run the government. They want the positions, they want the money, they want the influence. That's what the disciples are thinking about. We know that they think things are unfair, but what they really want is justice for them and people like them, but it's a zero-sum game. For them to get justice, it means somebody else gets injustice. For them to win means somebody else gets to lose. It's just a different set of losers and a different set of winners. And I think this is pretty sobering. Peter got it so wrong that he almost altered the course of history. And it actually makes me wonder about the advice that I give to people and the Jesus that I portray to other people. What if Jesus had taken the bait? If Jesus had taken the bait, Jesus had kicked out the Romans, established the Jewish kingdom again, Jesus would have been just another political ruler, and maybe there would have been 50 or 60 years of glorious Jewish home reign. And eventually, Jesus would have gotten old and would have died. Jesus would have been put into a tomb that would have been very elaborate and very nice, befitting the king of the Jews, and Jesus would still be there. He would not have been resurrected. And to quote the Apostle Paul, we would still be dead in our sins. That's how we almost missed Easter. Instead, Jesus flips it on his head and loses in order to win. Because political power is transitory. What Jesus wants is to change people's hearts. And the only way that you do that is not through force, it's through a love that knows no boundaries, that will even go to the cross. Jesus lost big time. But the result of the biggest loss of all time was the biggest win ever. Because it reminds us that love wins. Love triumphs over systems and powers and politics. And there's another thing that Jesus brings full circle here in talking about this about himself. In the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives the Beatitudes, that crazy topsy-turvy thing where he's like, all of you who think that you're losing, you who are meek, you who are powerless, you who are grieving, yeah, you're actually the winners. And it doesn't make much sense when he does it at the beginning, but here at the end, Jesus says, all you people who think that you lost, you're going to win with me. He brings that full circle too. And we may need to be rewired about that because it doesn't come naturally to us. So there was the danger of missing Easter at the very beginning. And we still have the danger of missing how we apply Easter to our lives. I mean, the big deal about Easter is that evil can be overcome. Evil has been overcome, but not by more evil. The ends do not justify the means. Evil has been overcome, but not by using the tools of the kingdom, not by using the tools of the empire, but by using the tools of the kingdom. The kingdom doesn't come through brute force. The kingdom comes through love and grace and new community. One of my favorite bloggers and podcasters, Carey Nieuwhof, who if you aren't following, you should, said, the culture needs an alternative to itself, not an echo of itself. And as the people of God, we have so much more to offer because we've received the grace and the love of God. And when we don't live as our best selves, when we don't reflect the character of Jesus in our interactions with other people, we show that at core, we're just like everybody else. We just do something different on Sunday mornings. And if we're just like everybody else, the best we can shoot for is political gain. But why not redeem the universe and everyone in it? Why not give people real hope that the world and their lives have value? Why not operate out of love instead of force? Why not operate out of grace instead of retribution? Easter is about changed hearts and changed lives. And that means that how you react to it matters. It means that your character matters. Now, I've noticed that in a lot of political discussions that are going on, it centers around other people's character. You know, you bring up your person that you are behind, and you say, I like my person, and your person has some real character flaws. Well, what does the other person say? Well, your person has some pretty dramatic character flaws too. You know, and then what do? Well, I mean, one possibility is to not be friends with them anymore, but I don't think that's a good one. You know, one possibility is to get rid of the other people, and the ends justify the means, but they don't. The other option is to examine not their characters, but yours. And we know that character matters, but sometimes we're more interested in getting what we want. So in the face of Easter, God save us from settling for what the disciples would have settled for. They would have settled for so much less than what God actually wanted to do. I'm grateful for Easter. I'm grateful that Jesus never lost his focus. And I pray for all of us that Easter is like this blue arc flashing across your radar screen that will challenge you to see what God is up to in your life and in your world. That will help you not to confuse your wants and your desires with God's plan. That will keep us from being an echo chamber of the culture. That will keep us from settling for too little. And perhaps the blue streak will help you to realize for the first time that there is a God who will go to the nth degree, to the death degree, for you to understand that you're loved. And I pray that that blue arc will help all of us clearly see and to be willing to rewire our lives to live into the new Easter reality. So let me ask you 3 questions. Number 1, what does the resurrection of Jesus mean for you? Number 2, is your life providing an alternative to the culture or an echo of it? And number 3, if Jesus had the conversation with you that he had with Peter, would he tell you not to tell anyone? Let's take a moment and pray, roll those things around in our heads, and then I'll close us.
Hi, thanks for watching. The people of Harbor Covenant Church really want you to know the love that God has for you, want to grow with you in faith, and want to serve alongside you, not only to help others do the same, but also to make our families and our communities better. If that sounds like something that you can get on board with, then like, follow, and drop us a comment in the video. Watch some more videos on our channel or come visit us on Sunday. You can find out more about Harbor Covenant Church at harborcov.church.